Even though the introduction to the Canterbury Tales in your textbook is really, really good, I did want to do just a little brief introduction and say some things about this beautifully written and very important book before you begin to read. You will find it challenging. I will just tell you that. And I've done a couple of things that I hope will be helpful because I know not all of you are English majors. I have included in the in the folder where the reading material is for this module, I have included a little bit more modernized version of the general prologue, which introduces all of the characters. So it might not be quite as hard for you to read. And I also wanted to show you William Blake, who was, of course, the Romantic poet and commercial engraver and visionary artist who was writing. He was born in 1757 and was writing up into the 1800s. And this was his engraving of the Canterbury pilgrims setting out from Southwark to Canterbury, to the cathedral there to pay their homage to St. Thomas à Becket, who was murdered by 4 knights of Henry II. I've heard the quote different ways, but supposedly Becket was murdered because Henry II said in front of a crowd of knights, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And the knights murdered him in his own cathedral at the altar. And of course, he then became a martyr to the faith. If you want to look at this in detail, I have the web address on this slide of the Blake Archive, and lots of things you will have access to that I did not have access to back when I was a graduate student. You're going to have access to so much material that has been digitized in places like the British Library, which I've been using already, as I'm sure you've noticed for this course. The Blake Archive basically sets out to find and make high-quality digital images of everything they can find, so that scholars and others can look at it. But they have a feature on that website that will let you magnify the image so you can see it a little bit more clearly than on this little slideshow. And you can also see where Blake has written in below the engraving the names of all of the different pilgrims that Chaucer is describing in the prologue to his tales. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales is in Middle English, and Middle English is, students sometimes wonder, or even when you were young maybe, why some things in English are spelled the way they are. Also, you might wonder why we have silent E's. Well, in Middle English, most scholars say there was no such thing as a silent letter. The E's would have a schwa, an upside down E. That's how that's shown in diacritical markings in dictionaries. And that schwa sound was an sound. And sometimes that E was pronounced, but sometimes it was elided because if you look at a word, for example, like supposed to, I was supposed to clean my room. Well, supposed has a D at the end of it, but we elide that D, we skip over it, we blend it into the T because those two sounds are so similar that we don't hear it most of the time when we say it. All right, so we say supposed to, used to, but it's supposed to. He was supposed to have been a great man. The English also in many of these particular versions was not really regularized. So people spelled things differently from one version to the other. And this was even after the advent of the printing press, although when Caxton later, following Chaucer, came up with the printing press, and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was one of those works that was printed a lot, it did work toward regularizing spelling, because people would look at the print and there weren't as many, maybe just errors, that a calligrapher or someone who was writing the text, who was scribing the text by hand, not as many of those kinds of changes would get made. And so, we know that we have different spelling from British spelling. We spell honor Honor, and the Brits spell it Honour. So English has a lot of sort of subcategories: American English, British English, and so on and so forth. And certainly in this time period, before English was as regularized and Dr. Johnson hadn't come along with his dictionary, and there weren't the rules were learned, but Latin rules were the ones that were actually learned in school. There are a lot of little differences between those. Now, so when you look at this prologue, and I remember I had to memorize it, I think, as an undergraduate. I'm pretty sure it wasn't high school. I'm pretty sure probably when I was about 18, I had to memorize this. And I think I can get down to the bottom of this passage without having to look. I don't have as much of the sort of prologue to the prologue that I used to have. But one of the interesting things about it is that, at least in this passage, and some of them are really hard, you're constantly, doing this thing of looking back and forth and bobbing back and forth to look at the footnotes. So, to read this entire thick book would certainly take you, I mean, we could spend a semester on nothing but the Canterbury Tales and still feel as though there was more that we could have covered, should we want to. So you can see, of course, that Juan kind of looks like when, we know that. We can figure out April. We can probably figure out, since it's April showers bring May flowers, we can figure out the showers sweet. But one of the things I want to point out too, I talked about the fact that the letters, none of the letters are silent. The reason we still pronounce draft, Draught, if we're talking about a draft of beer, for example. And we spell night, Night, instead of Nite, which still gives us that E to explain, is that it preserves, as hard as this is to read, modern English spelling preserves a lot of the history of the language. So I just want you to hear this. Oh, and by the way, if watch the little film, I think it's probably a student film, but it's this young guy who is actually doing this prologue to the prologue in rap. And I mean, he nails it. He nails the pronunciations, and it's just quite wonderful to see what he does with this poem, and I think you'll really enjoy it. But I did want to read through it with the words on the page for you, because that way you can kind of follow along, and I really couldn't find somebody who was doing that to suit me in on YouTube. Juan that April with his shores sota, the dracht of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in swish liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Juan Zephyrus eke with his sweet breath, in spirit hath in every holt and heath the tender croppers, and the youngest son hath in their arm his half-core sirana, and smalle falle smakken melodia, that slapen all the night with open air. Now, I probably made some mistakes in that. But it's spring. They're setting off during sort of Easter season to feast and pay homage to this martyr in the name of Jesus. But inspired, breathed in. The west wind has breathed into every holt and heath, into the tender crops, and the young sun is up in the air, and the small birds are making songs. Now, if you look at the textbook, there's also a little bit of information about the verbs. Why do we have, for example, the verb taken? I take, I took, I have taken. Well, you can see that machen was a word that was made past by adding that in to it. And you can see that slapen. And so we get that is like residue, if that's the right word, in our language from our past. And then, of course, we have nicht, which sounds a lot like night. Also, sometimes even a little bit later, perhaps in this, I'm trying to remember if there's a poem and I'm not coming up with one. A little bit later in this course, there's going to be some poems that sometimes the rhyme will seem a little off to you, but you have to remember that just because we pronounce those words this way does not mean that they have always been pronounced that way. Because language is organic, and we change it. We made it up from the very first, and we change it, I guess, to suit ourselves. Now, this is the entryway to Canterbury Cathedral. You see that there is an opening there, a big gate, and that you go underneath the gate, and then the cathedral is on the inside. This cathedral was built in 1070, and that was a century before Thomas A. Becket was murdered there. And so Thomas Becket then is the holy, blissful martyr, whose blessings the pilgrims are wending off to seek. So if we look at then, everybody wants to start doing things in the spring. Well, people in this time period were no different, and they didn't have central heat. And so as they spent their winter inside and they shivered with the cold, when it got to be spring, and April is absolutely beautiful in England, and it's absolutely beautiful here, nature would prick them in their hearts, all right? And we get the same word, to have courage is to have heart. So nature would sort of prick them, and then they would want to sort of go do something on their spring break instead of just sitting around. They wanted to get out and enjoy their lives. And so the prologue goes on to say, so pricketh him natura in her courages, than a long and folk to gone on pilgrimages, and palmares for to saken strange strandes, to ferne hallways, coth in sundry landes, and specially from every sheerest ende of England to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful martyr for to sake, that hame hath holpen one that they were sake. So what do we learn there? Well, sundry, if you go to a store that has sundries, lots of variety, lots of different things. So they wanted to go away, and they didn't just come from Southwark, they came from every shire in England. And St. Thomas à Becket, from Chaucer's words, would seem to be someone that they felt was praying for them when they were sick, that God would make them feel better. Now, so here he is. Here is the narrator of the poem. Now, the word that we use to describe the kind of work this is frame. It's a frame story. So Chaucer sets up this frame of the trip to Canterbury, and he develops each of these characters who tell tales that are very revealing of who they really are and very revealing of their concerns. And one of the wonderful things about the Canterbury Tales is that Chaucer really writes about people from all different stations of life, from the very, very lowest to the very, very highest. Now, one of the things that medieval people believed very strongly was in a philosophy called the Great Chain of Being. And that Great Chain of Being philosophy was very, very useful to to get people to sort of accept what they were given. We were all created in the image of God, but God created us to do different things. God created the divine rights of kings, and so the king was in a different station from the lowest feudal serf, who was in a higher station than the other creatures who were not human, and the sheep were higher than the worm. And so the right way to think about the world was to feel blessed and feel good about your station, whatever that station was. And of course, had Chaucer not sort of been married into people who were more noble, if he had come from a higher station, perhaps he would not have been able to be so accurate in his portrait of people. I don't want to belabor this because I don't want this slideshow to be a million minutes long. But when we get to Shakespeare, you'll hear that there's been some controversy over whether Shakespeare actually wrote his plays. Now, I'm not a Shakespeare scholar, and I don't play one on TV, and I'm not going to pretend that I know the answer to this. But I've always thought that was just kind of an asinine argument. Primarily because you have to have something, it's like conspiracy theories. You have to be so convoluted in your thinking to come up with all of these alternative ideas about who Shakespeare was. And I feel the same way about Chaucer. I think it would be much harder for someone who was extremely erudite. Now, Chaucer was educated. I mean, he knew languages. He went about the world. The editors of the text point out that when he went to Italy, he possibly ran across the work of Boccaccio, who was writing about some aristocrats who were terrified of the Black Plague, and they had fled to the countryside, and they were telling each other stories, some noble, a lot of them really bawdy, and about things that were vulgar, and Chaucer does the same thing. So I don't want to imply that Chaucer was not an educated person or sophisticated person, but he was not at the top level, and he sort of worked his way up through the ranks, as you'll read when you read the little biographical information. I'm not going to tell it to you twice in the introduction. So Chaucer was not stupid or not uneducated. He was not a cadman who was somehow divinely inspired. But I think it would be much easier for someone like that, or like Shakespeare, who is kind of middle class, upper middle class, who was really smart and had learned a lot of stuff, to be a great writer than someone who was very elite. Because I honestly don't think that very elite people in general pay much attention to the poor folks that surround them. I think they're invisible to the people who serve them their food. who clean their toilets, who do these things, who like the miller would mill their grain. They don't notice those people because for most of them they're not important. Now, I'm not saying it couldn't happen, that someone might put on the garb of plain folk and move among them. I just, to me, it's always seemed highly unlikely. And so, we see Chaucer inspiring everybody from Shakespeare on. Um, and in some ways, this is very much a collection of short stories that has these sort of interchanges in the middle that connect the tissues of it. So Chaucer sort of ends that very first little passage by saying, by kind of setting the frame scene so we know what to think. He says, ready to winden on my pilgrimage to Canterbury with full devout courage, et nicht were coma into that hostel raya, well 29 in a company of sundry folk, by adventure falla, in fellowship, and pilgrims were they all, that toward Canterbury wooden read.